To countdown. Hello, welcome to the second very slick episode of the KurosawaCast. I'm again your host, Rob Beams, and I'm joined as ever by Mr. Craig Ennis. Hello, Craig.
Good morning. I've only been up for about 25 minutes. I overslept a little this morning.
Yeah, I set an alarm because I knew we had podding to do, which went against my lazy nature. Anyway, we need into.
Are you calling me out? Are you calling me out 30 seconds in?
So basically, if you're listening for the first time, which is very likely, the basic gist. The basic gist of the podcast is that Craig is a film teacher and a filmmaker with a guilty secret, harboring a guilty secret, which is he'd never seen a film by Kurosawa. Kurosawa, one of my favorite directors. So we're going through them in chronological order. We did last time Sanshiro Sagata and its sequel, Sanshiro Sagata Part 2. And now we're going with his second film, The Most Beautiful, and his fourth film, The Men Who Trod on the Tiger's Tail. So let's start off with The Most Beautiful. What was? Do you want me to give some context to it first, or should we go? Let's go straight in with your opinion. Let's go straight in and sort of talk about how you felt about it. What was your sort of? Because I know you've been sort of gathering your thoughts on each film in terms of what your expectations were as well, because you're going in basically blind on all the films, right?
Yeah.
So what was your sort of expectation on this one, and then how did that play out?
Well, as as a sort of a conceit for the podcast, I've been really limiting what I know about the films before I watch them. So I've been kind of I've been watching them on BFI player for the time being, the ones that are on there. So I've been reading the synopsis and trying to sort of think about my preconceptions a little bit. And this describes it as an artful propaganda film that anticipates the social realism of his post-war films. Kurosawa takes an approved wartime theme of personal inclination, willing sacrifice for the sake of national emergence, turns into a documentary on women in an optics factory. It is their dedication which is the most beautiful, but most impressive is Kurosawa's grasp of his material, the way he makes us care about whether a lens is ground properly.
So with that in mind, that's what you knew going in, right?
Yeah, that's what I knew going in.
Did it live up to that billing in your
I was thinking about a cross between a kind of what's the word? An ideologically opposed Ken Loach film. I was thinking a cross between that and something like Locke, when it was talking about when a lens is ground properly. So I was thinking about Locke. I don't know if those of you have seen Locke. It's a Tom Hardy film set in a car, which is in part a concrete pouring procedural.
Yes.
You just learn so much about how concrete is poured in large. So I was thinking a little bit along those lines. Thinking about the time as well, I was also thinking a little bit about sort of Allied propaganda films, and maybe not just the kind of why we fight stuff, the sort of thing that you wouldn't necessarily think of immediately as a propaganda film, the sort of Casablancas of this world. So I was thinking about something like that, and then the film starts with a message that says attack and destroy the enemy.
Yeah, I do like. There's a bit. I don't want to jump around too much, but there is a bit I wrote down because I thought it was wonderful, where the women that work in this optics factory are like singing a song, and they're really happy, and they're singing it in like a really upbeat sort of tempo and everything. And one of the lines I wrote down was, "Today we will do our best to help destroy America and Britain." And I thought that was very nice, very charming.
There's a disclaimer that says information movie of the people or something like that. It says attack and destroy the enemy, and this is immediately after I've clicked a BBFC disclaimer that says I accept this guidance. So I'm like, okay, so maybe we're not too far off with Ken Loach. I think the level of ideology is going to be quite
pronounced.
Quite pronounced, yeah.
And would you say it's fair that it really isn't to some extent? Because I'll give my sort of feelings very, very briefly on the film, kind of on a high level. The first time I saw it, I heard it's this propaganda film, and I thought it was going to be. I actually found the Sanshiro Sugata films more propagandistic in some ways than this. There's clearly a very deep propaganda bent to this. There's propaganda posters that come up. There's the propaganda songs they sing. It's clearly about self-sacrifice and the value of all working together for the war effort and all of that. But the way that it does have this kind of semi-documentary style, the way that it does seem to focus very kind of quite very humane, I think, on the women and their individual lives and their emotions and everything. Like, it doesn't paint the women as like super soldiers, they're not like in their they're not shown as the most valorous examples of kind of the Japanese worker. They some of them, there's a bit at the beginning that's very telling that I really enjoy, which reminds me of, I can relate to it as someone who worked at Sainsbury's, like the kind of the bit where they're all chatting with each other and then they pretend to be working as soon as like supervisors walk by, which you wouldn't necessarily expect to see in the propaganda film. You'd expect to see like hardworking people.
I would agree with you, except what they're actually chatting about is the fact that their quota's only been. They're upset because their quota of lenses they've got to make has been increased by 50%, and the Americans have been and the men have been increased their quota by 100%.
This is true. That's
the only thing they're talking about, and they feel like I put a little note. I think this might be proto-feminist, this film.
It's interesting.
They argue that they don't want as much as the men have to do. That would be too much, but they
reckon they can do 2/3. Yeah, no, yeah. It's another thing I noted, actually, the sequence that's where their sort of boss. I don't know if she's their actual leader or just their sort of de facto sort of point of leadership.
She's sort of the mother hen who also runs the kind of the
like the dorm.
The dorms, yeah.
No, there's two different ones, because there's the mother hen who runs the dorm, and then there's the lady that has the more senior job with the men checking the lenses. And that's the actress Yoko Yaguchi, real name Kato Kiyo, who ended up marrying Kurosawa after this film, which I will talk more about later. But there's a note I made about this kind of very incongruous scene where she goes to the bosses. She goes to Takashi Shimura, actually, who I mentioned from previous podcast on Sanshiro Sugata, who's a great actor through Kurosawa's movies, who plays like the boss of the factory. So I'm always happy to see him. And she goes to him and asks for the quotas to go up. And then it cuts to her among all the girls in the cafeteria or something. And they're all cheering and celebrating because she got the quotas increased. It doesn't seem like, you'd think she was the one they're all just like, oh, fucking hell. Yeah. But yeah.
But yeah, this kind of, we jumped forward a little bit, but there's like, it starts obviously with everybody in the factory, and there's the men doing their announcements, and everyone's lined up and kind of standing silently, and it's this really kind of, you can imagine that footage sort of with a different voiceover being used for other purposes. Do you know what I mean?
I know what you mean.
It's so militaristic to begin with, only for the first 5 minutes or so, and then it really does kind of transition into what is a sort of twisted Ken Loach film. In the Ken Loach film, the women have got these awful working conditions, and their family lives are falling apart, and their personal lives are encroaching, and the bosses just don't care, or they've got their own problems, and they're part of a system that is also eating them up and chewing them up. Whereas in this, everybody is entirely committed to making these lenses, and every time somebody has a personal problem, it's because
they're so unhappy that their life is getting in the way of making the lenses, aren't they?
Exactly.
That's what happens. People get sick and things, and it's just like, oh no, they're gonna stop me making lenses. Like, yeah, no, people are very dedicated. The only thing that makes me feel like this is not just war propaganda. It's still definitely propaganda, but the only thing that makes me think this isn't just war propaganda in that sense is that to this day is a very big part of the Japanese psyche. The idea that you kind of everything, like the work-life balance in Japan is notoriously terrible, and people to this day still sort of put great value on the company they work for. Right. So while it's still definitely propaganda, because obviously it's a kind of a national propaganda, isn't it, about just like the Japanese psyche, and you've got to do everything you can, prostrate yourself for the business and for work and for production. That's still very much a propagandistic thing, but there's elements to it where it's not too different to the psyche now or too different to the psyche pre-war. It doesn't, apart from a few,
from my point of view, it was like Jacob Rees-Mogg or David Cameron had script doctored sorry, we missed you. Yeah, that's what it felt like. It was like it was Ken Loach being rewritten by David Cameron during the Big Society era.
Yeah. I think the thing that strikes me as incongruous about it, because it does take, as people who watched last time will know, one of the books I draw on quite a lot in research for the episodes is the definitive Kurosawa, but really Donald Ritchie's The Films of Akira Kurosawa. And in his writing about The Most Beautiful, he goes in great detail about it being this kind of early documentary film in terms of Japanese documentary. It very much goes into the idea of it being documentary and the realism of it, which I think is fair. But I think the one area where the realism really breaks down and where it becomes very nakedly propagandistic for me, and this relates kind of to what you were saying about what the Ken Loach film would do differently, is that the bosses are like unrealistically sympathetic, aren't they? Like the bosses, like every time they've got a problem and they're like, "Oh, we're not going to make us pay lenses," the boss is like,
will do it.
Well, even that, it's not just that the girls will do it. It's that, no, don't worry, you're working too hard. Don't push yourself. You don't need to make that many lenses. And they're like, no, we really must make the lenses. And then the boss is like, okay, if you insist. Whereas I'm sure there was a little bit more sort of coercion and things like that going on. But other than that, it always did feel to me like, it struck me the first time I saw it as being quite a tender film.
Yeah,
and something I wanted to bring up about it. Yeah, sorry.
It's got this very kind of gentle, but it's got a very gentle but very kind of forward kind of not plodding. It's got a really good forward momentum to it. It's got this really gentle momentum where you're kind of dipping in with a few of the different women who work in the factory, and kind of it's almost vignettes, isn't it? You kind of pop into somebody who's ill and can't work. You're popping in with somebody else who gets injured, and then that affects the quota. And there's this ongoing graphic of a graph that keeps going up and down and up and down. But it's all very character led, and it's very kind of it's very, very engaging. Like, this is by far the best of the 4 films that I've seen so far.
Yes. I would say it's the best of the kind of the war period ones for certain. Something I wanted to say about it, which you may not be aware, I'm sure you're kind of aware of it, like it won't surprise you, but you may not be literally sort of perfectly aware, is that this is the only Kurosawa film that really has female characters in it at all. Like, the cast of this movie is women, and then apart from kind of the upcoming romance film One Wonderful Sunday, which is one of the next ones we'll look at, after that he really doesn't go near women too much in his films. You know, he does Throne of Blood, so he has like a Lady Macbeth in that, but women are kind of notoriously not really his strong suit. He doesn't really make any other films about women. Certainly there are female characters, but these are the only films really about women, or this is the only film about women. And what's interesting about that as well is that the other 2 of the kind of canon of like the great Japanese directors of the era, Ozu and Mizoguchi, are famous for their films about women. You know, Mizoguchi's most celebrated films are about women, and all of Ozu's films, women take center stage. They're about the family, but they focus very much on daughters, and you know, Setsuko Hara, of course, is the star of most of Ozu's classic films. So that's kind of odd as well, because Kurosawa is a very kind of masculine director in a way. He takes great influence from people like John Ford. His films tend to be quite martial. There's a lot of samurai and these kind of things going on in his movies, and as humanistic as they get, they tend not to really deal with women at all, you know, quite frankly. So yeah, this is interesting to me because, and the reason I bring it up really in the context of this film is because he has such a kind of he's made such a tender movie about the women in this film that then strikes me as odd. It's like, well, he could have done, other films like this or told those stories.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they're great. Like I said, I'm jokingly said there's a proto-feminist thing going on here, but I don't think it's particularly. I don't know. It's about the women are, there is a story function of these are people who work in the factories and they're going to work hard, and the anything that is kind of specifically a female narrative in here is a little bit is a bit vague and sometimes quite condescending. Like there's a woman who gets fevers in the evenings. There's another woman who's got some unknown illness and has to go away to recuperate. They can do 2/3 of the men's quota, but that's not, there's a little bit of that, and I think all the parts are really well played, and all the characters are really engaging. But I wouldn't
make any claims for it.
No, it's not Carol or The Hours or but it's interesting that it stands out in his filmography in that way. What was I going to say? Stylistically, this was much more advanced as well than the others.
Yeah, like the cutting in particular. There's some really great montages.
The training montages from Sanshiro Sagata were in this film, not literally, but there's some great stuff where they're playing volleyball and stuff like that it's starting to sort of pick up a little bit. And there's a train scene that's really tense for no real reason. I couldn't quite figure out narratively, but it just came. There's a bit where one of the women's coming back from being ill, and everybody else is out to meet her, and they're across from this. They're on the opposite sides of a train crossing, and this train comes by as they're waiting to meet, and it just comes for an inordinately long amount of time, just sort of passes by the screen. And I don't know if I'm just kind of, it felt really Hitchcockian, like something was going to happen. Nothing does, but it just was like there was this strange thing going on that was, this tension was mounting over something that is ultimately kind of anticlimactic. But I found that really interesting. And then after that, there is this scene with the broken lens, which is really, really good. Like, so I used to work as a projectionist once upon a time, and even before I worked at Duke of York, which is an art cinema in Brighton, I worked at Cineworld, and their projection booth basically ran the entire length of the building, and you'd have all the projectors in one room, side by side, opposite sides of a corridor, and the lights had to be very, very low. And the way you knew if anything was wrong basically was sound. Like if a film was too tight and running through the projector too tight, it would sound off, or if a plate wasn't spinning, you could hear something because you couldn't really see. So the projection booth had a very kind of signature rhythm and sound going to it, and when a film finished or something was wrong, you could hear something going wrong. And there's the scene in the factory where there's all the lens grinders and machinery whirling away, and then something goes wrong, and you hear it as kind of metronomic sound, and something goes wrong and you hear a breaking, and then the machinery starts sounding different, and there's this quick rush to try and find out where the problem is, isn't there? And then everyone goes into a little panic, and then it kind of, the sound cuts out, and there's somebody there who's kind of realizes that the problem is at their end, and it just works really, really nicely. It's this really kind of tense scene of it's just this tense scene of it going wrong, and everybody sort of
you mentioned the procedural concrete pouring of Locke, and it's not that in terms of the fact that, in Locke, obviously Tom Hardy's character talks a lot about concrete pouring, and you don't really get any kind of monologues about how lenses are made and all of that. No. But procedurally, you do see the work getting done quite a lot, and there's a particularly nice montage. I mean, Donald Ritchie in his book, he points it out as being probably the most kind of interesting sequence in Kurosawa's, among all of Kurosawa's movies, the scene that goes along with the that kind of marching music, and then it cuts between them all at their different stations. They're all doing different things in close up. And actually, in Kurosawa's Something Like an Autobiography, he was a nice quote from him actually saying that it was the most. Yeah, he said it was like the most beautiful sequence of his whole career, or something like that. I can't remember. I've got it written down somewhere here. But basically confirming that to him it was a very important sequence. He actually said that this is a quote I've just come across in trying to look for that one. He actually says in his book, "The most beautiful is not a major picture, but it's the one dearest to me," which is quite interesting as well, considering it's a lot of people might consider this a throwaway Kurosawa film. But yeah, that sequence in particular with the women in close up at their machines, I thought was really, really striking, the way it was edited and framed, and it really gives you, similar to what you're saying about the previous bit, that sort of idea of the process as well, the different people on the different stations, the machinery. You get a lot of emphasis on these bits of machinery and things. It's quite fascinating.
I love sort of analog technology fetishism, the close-ups of things moving and things working like that. I'm a sucker for that entirely. And there is a lot of that. If you're into cogs and gears, there's a lot in this film for you. The other thing I found actually was that because everybody is so unselfish in this film, like there's all these little, your cynical mind will start to think that when people kind of are whispering in corners and things like that, that they're trying to shirk, or they're trying to, but invariably somebody's worried about somebody else not being well or not be doing their job properly, and everybody's got this kind of common goal, and there's no real all the antagonism, all the kind of tension is external in that way. It's all down to somebody's physical health or their family or something like that. Like there's people who don't want to go to their mother's funeral because it's going to take them away from their workstation. There's something really, and there was something really seductive about the collective goal and the unity that they have, actually. Like there's something really kind of this, it's obviously not, it's obviously propaganda, but there is something very, very, it's good propaganda. Like it's seductive. I want to go and live in a dormitory with a load of friends and have a job and feel part of
volleyball, apparently.
Play volleyball, yeah.
Yeah, they're having a great time, weren't they, at that factory? Even when quotas are down, like it will cut to them talking about how like quotas are down and they're behind, and then they'll be playing volleyball. So it was the most chill management of that play. It was very much like a sort of one of those California tech companies where people are just kind of, there's sleeping pods and things like that. Almost the idea that they could just go on the volleyball court, chill out. But yeah, it's. Did you in your Wikipedia reading, did you come across anything about the production of the film? Do you know anything about the circumstances around its making?
I've not. No, I've read that. I read that Kurosawa has come out and said that the censorship that he was under in post-war Japan, which I know a little bit about, because famously Godzilla was atomic bomb kind of metaphor analogy, wasn't it? I know a little bit around that. He said that the censorship that the Americans put him under was far less onerous than the Japanese censorship.
No, he writes very tenderly in his book about his relationship with an American censor who he really enjoyed talking to, and he's very angry in all of his bits where he talks about the Japanese censors during the war. The anger just oozes off the page of his autobiography.
I heard it was an approved theme. So, like, you're allowed to talk about this theme.
But for the most beautiful?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, basically what was supposed to happen was they approached him to make, the Navy approached him to make a film about Zero fighter planes. And he was all gearing up to make this film about fighter pilots, which is much more of something you'd expect Kurosawa to make rather than this. And what happened was, he says in his autobiography, it was clear they were losing the war at the time they started making this, because basically there were no Zero fighter planes that could be spared to make a film. They didn't have enough of them, and they were all off in the war. And because of that, they just weren't able physically to make the film about fighter planes. So he kind of turned this out instead, and focused on something smaller scale, that they could actually do. And what's interesting kind of speaks to the kind of documentary aspect, and it's almost kind of proto-method in some way. I don't know how common, maybe from other things in film history, how common this sort of approach is, but Kurosawa had all of these women. All these women quit acting after the film, by the way, which he attributes to how hard he was on them. All of them quit acting. Basically, he had them all live at the dormitories while they were making the film. He had them actually train day and night to do the marches and things like that. He had them all learn to use the machinery and everything. They had to basically method it. And one of the things was, I don't even know why he employed actresses, because he might as well have got factory workers. But he talks about how actresses are very self-conscious, or not just actresses. He talks about performers and actors in general, but he talks about how they're very self-conscious. They've learned all these behaviors. They've learned all these mannerisms, and how before they started shooting the film, he just worked really hard to try and beat those things out of them, and make it so that they were as much like I think he says here, like as much like not an ordinary young girl. He wanted to strip I wanted to return their original status as ordinary young girls. He wanted to strip the theatricality and everything, take off the makeup, take off everything, and just have them be very plain and ordinary people. And that comes across, and they do feel very authentic and very real. But the effect of it was that pretty much every woman involved in this film quit acting afterwards. And what's quite funny about that as well is that, as I say, Kurosawa ended up marrying the star of the movie. And his proposal to her was incredibly bizarre, and I will read it out to you in a minute, but it's insane. But what's funny as well about it, that kind of shows the disparate, the kind of the gender roles here, and how kind of messed up it was that basically these people quit acting because of him, was that after his wife married him and quit acting, quit her job, because that's, to this day, like one of the reasons, this is a tangent, one of the reasons for the declining birth rate in modern Japan is it's true, but one of the reasons
I'm glad you
sort of finally tackling the big issues.
I'm glad you I'm glad you flagged that as a tangent.
Yeah.
But anyway,
one of the reasons is still to this day the idea that a lot of women don't want to get into marriages because the expectation remains that you leave your career. To some extent, very traditionally, you still are not expected to really work as a married woman. And what was interesting about this with Kurosawa and his wife is that she didn't know until after she married him and quit acting that he was making less than a third of what she made as a director. So she kind of ended up going to this life of poverty with this director when she was an actress in movies, making a lot more money than him, but she had to quit. But it was very strange. So basically, they did this really method thing. To the extent where the woman in the film who is at the dormitories, who plays the kind of the mother hen, as you said, she ended up playing that role in real life. Like she ended up being the sort of one calming and mentoring the girls and being there for them. The one who plays kind of the leader who Kurosawa married, she ended up taking on the role of being the leader and coming to Kurosawa with all their complaints. And apparently he argued with her incessantly throughout production, the woman he went on to marry, that she was always coming with grievances from the girls, and they were having all this. And it's this strange sort of, like in sociology, this idea of like labeling theory, those the standard, like the prison experiment and all that, like the idea that you put people in these groups, you tell them what they do, and then they do it. It seems to have happened on this film. The girls that work in the factory were the girls that work in the factory, the leader was the leader, and even though those were the roles in the movie. But what was really kind of fascinating and reading, I didn't remember from reading Kurosawa's autobiography like 10 or so years ago how much of a prick he is. But reading it this time around, I like it really comes across some really messed up stuff in this autobiography. So he has a chapter about his marriage, and he talks about how he proposed to his wife. And what happened was someone said he ought to get married. Just for practical reasons. It was like, well, you really ought to get married. You'll get, I don't know, more benefits that way or something. You'll get something if you get married. So he was like, oh, okay, but who should I get married to? And someone's like, well, what about that Yoko Yaguchi from the film? And then he was like, oh no, she's too strong-willed, And then his mate was like, yeah, but that's what you need. And so he's like, all right then. So he goes and proposes to her, and his proposal, as he writes it, this is what he said. He said, "It looks as if we're going to lose the war. And if it comes to the point," this is great, Craig, you'll love this. "And if it comes to the point of the honourable death of the 100 million, we all have to die anyway. It's probably not a bad idea to find out what married life is like before it happens." That was his pitch. And what happened? What happened, as he tells it, what happened after the honourable death of the 100 million, by the way, as I'm sure you can imagine, is the idea the emperor is going to give the word that they all just need to kill themselves. And so they thought this was going to happen, so they might as well get married anyway. So what happens next is
I was just going to say is that I don't know if we did this on the podcast last week, or if you texted me beforehand, but you sent me a quote, I think, that was Akira Kurosawa sounding like Alan Partridge.
Sounded like Alan Partridge, yeah.
So
no, I'll bring that up when we come to that film, but yeah.
So I think we're going to have to instigate a section of the podcast.
There's just bits of his autobiography that are like this. Yeah, 100%.
Kurosawa or Partridge.
Kurosawa or Partridge, yeah, for sure. So basically, so that was his proposal. That was his pitch. She said she'd think about it. She didn't get back to him, basically. So he ended up tracking her down and saying, "Look, yes or no." And he describes him asking her yes or no thusly. He says that he felt like General Yamashita Tomoyuki demanding surrender as he occupied Singapore in 1942. Which again is very Partridge.
I think I can understand why there's not many female roles in his later films.
So he had this weird thing. There's this whole story. It's very dramatic about his wedding. Like the shrine they ended up getting married at got bombed the next day by the Allied forces. Their first marital home that they moved out of got bombed the next day. So he very nearly was killed twice during the span of those months. But what was really strange is that he had a friend advocate on his behalf to this woman to try and get her to marry him. And he was sending this friend to go to her house to say, "Look, you should marry Kurosawa. He's a great guy." And ultimately, when he went General Yamashita Tomoyuki to demand the surrender of occupied Singapore in 1942 to get a yes or no answer, she handed him a stack of letters, like a big stack of letters. And he looked at them, and they were from the friend who was his advocate, telling her that Kurosawa is a terrible person and she shouldn't marry him. Right? His advocate had actually gone around there slagging him off. And apparently the only reason she married Kurosawa is because her mum said, "Well, who are you going to believe? The guy who slags off his friend when he's sent as the advocate, or the friend, you know?" So she ended up sort of siding with Kurosawa against this guy that just sent all the shit. And then in this weird Curb Your Enthusiasm twist to the whole thing, this friend who slagged him off and had this stack of letters slagging him off, Kurosawa kind of mentions casually how this guy continued to just come around their house throughout the marriage. He was always popping around. So it's just like this kind of, I guess it was this sort of Japanese formality thing where he couldn't tell him to sod off or something. I don't know. This guy was still in their lives, But anyway, it's a journey, his autobiography, and I don't know why I didn't remember this stuff from it. It's just, he's got some stories. But anyway, that was the most beautiful. I think we should move on to the other film. Just
one last thing. And this is just no real reason. What if in any other year, I would have found the fact that the employees have to have regular temperature checks very, very strange. But as that is my day-to-day reality now, when I get to work, I'll let it slide. But yeah, that was a weird point of order, really, that there's a lot of temperature checks in there. It was just a strange little...
I'll tell you what I remember most about this film, just before we move on to the other one, because I haven't mentioned it. The thing I remember about this film, and in the year since I first watched it to watching it again, the enduring image was the sequence of that main character, Kurosawa's future wife, whose name is Yoko Yaguchi. The sequence where she's looking for the cracked lens and she's tired. And it's such a great on-screen depiction of being tired and doing a job and being up. It reminds you of being up doing an essay late at night at uni or something. It's just she's there, she's just hunched over the desk, she's rubbing her eyes, she's really tired. But the montage of it where he cuts to the clock and they'll cut back to her, and each time he cuts back to her, he kind of pushes in a little bit more, and then we're kind of finally watching her face, and she just sells it really well as well. I think that's a really great sequence.
Yeah, I've put a note here saying because she's going through these boxes and boxes and boxes trying to find this defective lens, and I've put a note saying this level of attention to detail is beyond me. But also, that was the one thing after a film that was quite, like I say, quite seductive in this kind of this community building. That kind of final image of her over the desk checking these lenses in the middle of the night, as it kind of went, I found it quite depressing, and I don't know if that's, like you say, because I don't know if that's because of the knowledge of what ultimately how I'm not saying I wanted the Axis to win. Yeah. but
it's a vain effort, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But what's interesting about it, just to dwell on that scene a little longer, is her motivations, because these lenses are presumably for bombers and things like that, right? So they can see targets or something. But she's not right. I mean, that must be what they're for. The lenses are for planes and tanks and things like that.
They're for scopes. And
okay.
And there's also a line a little bit before where they're going, we've got to make everyone happen. And the directors, like into what you were saying earlier about them being really kind, it's like, well, they're going to be checked.
They're checked again. Don't worry about it.
Someone else is going to check them.
Like... what was interesting to me about it, and is that she's not motivated by. She doesn't turn around and say, "No, we need to find this lens because every faulty lens is an American that we're not killing." It's not like that. It's not like she's not motivated by the need to sort of win the war in that way. She talks about how she's worried that she's putting the lives of soldiers at risk with a faulty lens, and that people are going to die because she messed up. And I thought that was very sweet as well. Like that's where it's coming from her as a character, is worry and compassion for other people, not for wanting to make the war effort better or anything like that. Which, I think in worse, more blatant, less redeemable propaganda, it might have been something like that, but yeah. That was something I quite liked. So, The Men Who Tread on the Tiger's Tail, which is a film that I can never remember the correct name of, and every time I search for it, I get it slightly wrong.
Well, sometimes it's called Those Who Tread on the Tiger's Tail.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's partly why, because it gets written.
Might have a kind of transatlantic different translation.
Yeah, possibly. So, The Men Who Tread on the Tiger's Tail was made in 1945. But it wasn't released because of censors until 1952, I think.
Okay.
And supposedly there's kind of contradicting things about why. The common line on it is that the US thought the film was kind of too feudalistic because it deals with Japanese traditional themes and stuff. But then in Kurosawa's autobiography, he puts it down to the Japanese censors having a last vindictive go at him by flagging it in some way for the Americans. He talks about how he went to. I don't know if I have a juicy quote from it, but it's a very Partridge segment of the book where he talks about going. He bursts in to see the censors, and he talks. It's quite amazing, actually. He talks about how the Japanese censors, because they'd lost the war at this point, because this film was still in production. It started production before they lost the war and was in production when the Americans actually invaded. And so American soldiers ended up coming to the set and things like that. There's quite an interesting production history around this film in terms of the period. And John Ford visited the set as well, which Kurosawa didn't know until years later, because John Ford visited the set with a group of American generals who just were interested in watching the film being made. He found out years later when he met John Ford that John Ford was on the set during this film for some reason, which is just trivia, but it's interesting. But there's
a film in that. There's a
Netflix
one of those like
film. There's
Yeah.
one of those like My Week with Marilyn type films, isn't there, about John
Yeah.
Ford on the set of this Kurosawa film? Although they never spoke or met on the actual film. But like, and he talks about how one day making the film, he had to just call off shooting because of the fact that loads of American GIs turned up and just wanted to get pictures taken with the men in their costumes and pretending to be killed with samurai swords and all that kind of thing. And Kurosawa just had enough. Was like, right, close everything down. So anyway, there was a thing about the censors, was what I was getting to, which is the fact that he went to them after the film was made to give them a piece of his mind. And when he got to their offices, they were burning all the documents. They were just burning everything they'd written during the war years, basically, and just covering their tracks about all the stuff they'd written about, I guess saying this film doesn't say kill the Americans hard enough or whatever. And they were just destroying all the evidence. And he went there and started having a go at them about their censorship and about them and having this really heated argument with them. And part of the reason was because he got some criticism from them as a last kind of salvo from the censors. They criticized this film, The Men Who Trod on the Tiger's Tail, for the inclusion of the comedian Enoken, who is the mugging comedian who ruins this movie.
That's unfair. That's unfair.
We'll get to it in a minute. But they criticized having him in the movie and said that it makes a mockery of this old Japanese story having this character in it. And he was kind of giving them a piece of his mind about it and going on a rant about it. And he says that the reason it got delayed from release is because in one last dig at him, because of arguing with them about it, they made sure to remove something about the film's production, or it was not very clear. Like they got rid of some sort of certification or document about the production of the film that made it like an undocumented production or something, and it meant that the Americans were then, the paper trail wasn't quite there and the Americans were suspicious of it, and it wasn't until they reviewed it in 52 that they agreed to release it. So that, I'm just saying, there's a discrepancy where on the surface of it, like according to the Ritchie book, it's about the US thinking it's feudalistic, but if you look deeper into it, Kurosawa thinks it's actually a stitch-up job by the censors from the previous regime. But anyway, so this film, it's like under an hour long, right? Which is weird already.
Yeah. I was looking forward to that. I saw that it was 59 minutes. I could, because going into this, you said that there were a couple of made during the war propaganda films. So I was thinking along the lines of the equivalent of like an 80s B grade action film, like a kind of cinema of muscles. I knew it was about kind of feudalistic Japan. I was expecting some early kind of sword play, that kind of thing, and it would be those sort of right-leaning, muscle-headed action films you used to get that would star Chuck Norris or Steven Seagal or Invasion USA. That's what I thought I was expecting to get from this. I did not get that.
Exactly, and you could probably wish you had to some extent. I think so.
Can I just put it up on Front Street? This film is borderline unwatchable.
Okay. I'll give my context where I first saw it. It was one of the last Kurosawa films I was able to get hold of seeing. And I saw it at the cinema, actually. I saw it at the BFI South Bank because they did some kind of Kurosawa season, I guess. And the only one I saw during that season was this. And I went specifically because I'd never seen it at the time, couldn't get hold of it. And I really enjoyed watching it. Like, I enjoyed watching it at the cinema. I've seen it twice since. And, I do think it's watchable. I find it better than Sanshiro Sagata Part 2, which I know you enjoyed, but I would rather watch this any day of the week. The interesting background to it from I gleaned from the Don Ritchie book is that it's an amalgam of, there's apparently this story, he says, is more famous, like it's the equivalent amount of famous to Robin Hood in the West, like Japanese children. So apparently, like, to Japanese children, they know this story very, very well, right? And it's been adapted as a theatre production, but more famously is a kabuki theatre production that everyone knows. Everyone's seen this thing. He likened it to Robin Hood, I think I might have said. So Kurosawa basically took elements of the theatre production, the kabuki theatre production, and the historical event itself, his research on that, and in a theme, because I also read this about Sanshiro Sugata, in a theme to do with his early films, he wrote the screenplay in a single evening.
Okay.
Combining the results of the 2 plays and some historical information. And the music from the films, actually, there's like several musical sequences, and those bits are lifted directly from the theatre productions. They are from, yeah.
The story itself is really easy to sum up, isn't it? There's like, there's I can't get the. I was going to say
a group of monks. There's a group of monks
who aren't
that
monks.
have to,
they're disguised as monks, aren't they? They're actually shoguns, or shogun. I'm confusing.
No, they're not shoguns, but they are. I guess they are samurai. They're like the samurai retainers of a lord. The lord's got to get the hell out of Dodge because of some war or whatever. We're basically given a kind of Star Wars.
He's had a falling out with his brother, who is the shogun. Am I getting my terms right here? I'm not sure.
I mean, probably. It doesn't matter though, right? Okay. Like, so basically,
they've got to get from one sort of province to another, and in between there is a border checkpoint,
cross the checkpoint,
and they have to cross the checkpoint disguised as monks, and that's it.
That's the whole film. They've got to smuggle this guy over. It starts with a kind of Star Wars style crawl where it tells you
all of that. It tells you that information, doesn't it? Like, they've got to get past.
But it tells you all this information in the opening crawl that would be a much more interesting movie if it was in the movie.
Yes.
Like they could shoot that stuff if they had the budget and everything. That's like half an hour of movie that you just don't get, where they just go, by the way, all this interesting stuff's happening. There's a war and all this kind of stuff. But you don't see any of that.
No, we get walking instead. We get walking. We get a sort of Greek chorus. A musical number of people just sort of repeating what you've said, what you've just read, and then you see people walking, and then immediately there's this annoying kind of guide Sherpa kind of character who's talking too much and is the only one that's talking amongst these sort of 7 off-brand action figures without personalities.
It's interesting because I wrote down that
immediately I don't think I'm going to like this.
I wrote down Japanese Jerry Lewis. And then I read in
I put Martin Short or sort of Eddie Murphy.
And then I read in the Donald Ritchie notes that the film was like adding Jerry Lewis to the cast of Hamlet. He describes it. So my man Donald Ritchie was on the Lewis train with me watching this guy. But anyway, the thing with this film that I find interesting is, well, for one thing, it's very brief and it's a very short story. But the central encounter, the main bit where they're in the camp and he's trying to do the ruse. We'll
get to that because I've been really down on this film and I'm not entirely. But I just want to talk about this. Just the first 20 minutes is them sitting in the woods or walking through the woods, repeating information from the crawl, and then occasionally bringing in new bits of information that nobody has had access to. Like, they've all been together in isolation, moving through the woods. And then somebody will say, well, I've heard this. It's like, where have you heard it from? You've all been in the same little encampment. And that is the first 20 minutes, and it is interminable. But when you get to the actual checkpoint, a film breaks out.
It does, yeah. And that scene is very nice. And the whole kind of gimmick of it is this play on feudal relationships and protocols and rituals, which is what the kind of the Jar Jar Binks character in it is sort of flailing around gurning at, because he represents a kind of a guileless common man who doesn't really understand the significance of a lot of what's going on among these more sort of high class people, which revolves around the idea that basically in order to sneak through the checkpoint, the retainer has to beat his master. And this is something that no retainer would do to his master, so that's kind of the ruse to get through. But there's also a rub where the character played by the Sanshiro Sugata actor, who is the guy who runs the border checkpoint, there's also apparently controversy about his role in the film, because the film kind of posits that maybe he knew all along that it was a ruse, but he was so moved by the guy beating his master that he decides to let them pass, and then he sends them the sake and all of this business.
I mean, this whole sort of 20-minute middle section of the film is really, really good. They get there, You've got some really clear kind of sort of screen geography. You've got they come in from the left. You've got everybody set up on the right. People come in around the back of them to sort of pincer them. They're there. You've got the guy in charge who kind of comes forward and starts questioning them, and you've got his suspicious second in command kind of thing. You've got the brother of the Lord who's hidden as another guide with this huge hat as well, sort of having to keep his head bowed, and his second in command has to take the lead as the lead monk and explain what's going on. There's all these kind of, it's really, really tense. There's kind of like some Proto-Leone extreme close-up stuff going on, as well as people are like that, as people are kind of watching each other. There's this kind of, they come up with this ruse that they're raising money to rebuild a temple. And he says, well, if you're raising money to rebuild a temple, you'll have a prospectus. Read me your prospectus. And he pulls out this blank scroll and very theatrically kind of makes up this kind of ad lib. Whose line is this anyway? Makes up this prospectus. And then the Lord is like, yes, that truly is a real prospectus. We'll give you some money. And they say, well, look, we're coming back this way in a few months. We don't want to carry it. Have it ready for us and we'll pick it up on the way back. But yeah, it's really appreciated. And the whole thing is just, it's really well done. It's really tense, but it's only for this 20 minutes in the middle. And obviously there's much more to this, obviously, in terms of what it means to feudal values and the idea of beating the master and that kind of thing. It's got a lot more resonance. And like you say, it's this old story that's 1,000 years old, that's known by everyone. But quite often the problem with old stories is there isn't a lot of meat on the bones, and some people are able to put a bit of meat on the bones as time goes, a bit more meat on the bones as time goes by. You see it with all sorts of adaptations of stories that are 100, 200, 300, 400 years old. They get told and retold and reimagined and kind of adapted. But for me, for a film that was kind of 60 years old, the problems were the kind of the very basic, like barely cinematic opening, which just immediately puts you up against this film, and my ignorance, my personal ignorance of Japanese feudal culture, and it was too much to bear, really. Like, as much as I really enjoyed the 20 minutes in the middle, I could have had the opening titles cut to 20 minutes, watched a short, because then it kind of, after that 20 minutes section, there's still another 20 minutes to go, and we get back into walking through the woods territory.
Did you come across anything about the production of this film?
No, just
it's very similar to what happened with The Most Beautiful. He was supposed to make a different movie, and what happened was, I think it was called Pointed Spear or something like that. I didn't write it down. But basically, he was going to make this epic. He was going to make this big feudal war epic type movie, like the kind he'd become famous for later in his career. And Kurosawa's obsessed with horses. Like, one of the first films he kind of co-directed with his mentor was about horses. He's also the only Kurosawa film I've never seen is a documentary made for Japanese TV about horses. Like, Kurosawa loves horses. And he wanted to make this film about these horsemen. But then they were deep into production. They were going to be shooting it very soon, and they went to find this location. They did a location scouting thing, and they found that all of the horses that were there, because this was like during the end of the war, everyone was starving. All the horses that were there in this place were all skinny and starving and emaciated, and they couldn't run. And he saw these horses and was like, we can't use this. So he talks about how the just doing that pre-production scouting, he feels like he destroyed his film by like doing that, and he couldn't make the movie. So he went to the studio saying, we can't make that film, but I can give you a film in a couple of weeks, very quickly, if we do this other thing. And the studio he says that it was a godsend for the studio when he told them he could make this film, because they had no money and they needed to put things in cinemas, but they didn't really have anything, so they needed things quick. And basically he pitched this to the studio as being, I only need one set, and I can shoot it in the woods behind the studio. So this was made in the woods behind Toho Studio and on one small set, very quickly.
Yeah, this is where the chronology of it, kind of chronology of what we've seen so far, kind of doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I guess in given the circumstances and the time it was made, that makes a little bit more sense. But like, if we went to see, what's it called? Kubrick's first film.
Oh, Fear and Desire.
Fear and Desire. We went to the cinema and we got to see the wonderful 40-minute documentary about the seafarers.
Yes, the Seafarers Union, which is better than Fear and Desire.
Which is better than Fear and Desire. But Fear and Desire is his first film, and it was shot in some woods by hook or by crook, with some very basic kind of crossing the line mistakes and things like that. It was like him, right? It was his film. It's basically film school, wasn't it? I'm going to go out with the stuff and do it very, very cheaply, very, very quickly, which kind of feels what this is. And I think I'd feel much, much warmer to it if it
was his first film.
Yeah. Whereas, like, something like I'm quite drunk the Kool-Aid yet, but I'm certainly eyeing up a glass after The Most Beautiful. Like, he's made something like that that's really, really artful and really, really thoughtful and really, really engaging. And he's made another film since that's a bit meat-headed but fun. And then it's like he's just kind of gone completely, I guess the circumstances of it being made in a couple of weeks, end of the war, no money.
I mean, the Americans, like I say, invaded during production, and it was all. So the fact that a film was even being made during that time, I find incredible. Like, you'd kind of imagine if you were just like the emperor's announcing your surrender and the American troops were moving in. Like, but I guess the reality of any war situation, I'm sure in Syria right now, like there are people in war-torn situations still going to work.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I guess that's sort of the reality of it.
I will say that the middle 20 minutes are really, really good, like really, really strong, really engaging.
There's some very bold editing in the film.
Absolutely.
It's great.
It's just that the beginning and the end are so inert. I'm sure the end would have more resonance if I understood the story better and the significance, because they do have the Lord and the servant sort of have a moment of truth and reconciliation about the beating, which doesn't hit home because I don't have that cultural understanding. But the like you say, the beginning, the kind of there's a tell don't show crawl, followed by 20 minutes of repeat don't show. Which was such a slog to get through. To get to that 20 minutes, it just felt like there's a really lovely short, or there's a really compromise. Like you say, it makes sense as a compromised bigger film here.
It's interesting that
it kind of feels like it should just have, I don't know, it was a long way to get to very little if it sat on a shelf for 7 years as well.
Yeah, I mean, something that I think is interesting about it. There's a quote from Kurosawa actually about why he decided to write in this comedy character, because this comedy character doesn't feature in the No story or the Kabuki. The comedy character is the only invention Kurosawa added to the story, and it's the thing that the censors hated, and which reading Dole Richie's book he hates. This Inokan character. And what's interesting about the reason he added this in was there's a quote about it where he brought the comedian in to compensate for the film's low budget, kind of like a special effect, I guess, kind of like adding Jackie Chan to a movie. And he says, no sets, couldn't move the camera very much. I had to give the picture an interesting form. I needed to make it lively. And so that's why he put the comedian in it.
So here's a question. got to be careful here because obviously me and you know each other very, very well, but the audience won't necessarily know the background of our conversations. So we've spoken a lot about Christopher Nolan in the past, and Rob's got a particular stance on Christopher Nolan's relationship to comedy, which he doesn't understand it in the way that a human being would. Is comedy something that pops up successfully in later Kurosawa films, or has he got a bit of a tin ear for comedy too?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because when you're dealing with foreign language film, like I often say about Coen Brothers or Wes Anderson, I don't know if those players comedic when they're translated, because a lot of the comedy in a Coen Brothers film or a Wes Anderson film comes from delivery, comes from specific word choices, repetitions of odd phrases and things like that. And I'm not sure necessarily how those things always translate. I think so basically with Kurosawa, I don't know. It could be that some of his films are kind of wryly amusing. I have no idea. My guess is no. My guess is no, there's no comedy. There's nothing like this in any of his feature films.
Okay. But I just wondered I just wondered if it landed similarly.
No. Well, the thing is I said, I think on my review on Letterboxd actually, is one of the interesting things I think about Tiger's Tale is the way it foreshadows things he later developed in Hidden Fortress, which I won't go into too much now because you've not seen Hidden Fortress. But Hidden Fortress has a bunch of guys kind of carrying their noble kind of master in disguise across enemy lines, and they have to go through a checkpoint. That's all in Hidden Fortress. Also in Hidden Fortress, the only other Kurosawa film with comedy characters in it. And those are, again, lowly characters who end up carrying the bags for the samurai. So there's this weird thing where Hidden Fortress is almost like a stealth remake of Tiger's Tale, but with a lot more action and stuff around it, and much better film. Famously influenced Star Wars and all of that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me as well because I read that Kurosawa really wanted to remake Tiger's Tale later in his career. And apparently he was very unhappy with sort of the limitations of it, the budget of it, and he thought that story could fit a more dynamic film and he wanted to remake it. And so I can kind of see how Hidden Fortress in a way was his attempt at doing that, which will be interesting to explore when we get there. But sorry,
yeah, I was going to say, no, I think a lot of the circumstances and the context that you've put here that does show that the production of this film is the much more interesting story. Like the idea that John Ford had gone off and served during the war as a camera person, as a documentarian, was on set. The idea that the GIs turned up, that the war was lost while they're making a propagandistic film. That
the censors burning all their records and all this kind of stuff. The
censors burning the records. That there is a Mank came out yesterday, didn't it? There is a film of that ilk to be made about this story. I think that would be very, very interesting. Basically,
yeah, probably better than this film. But I have time for it. I do think the comedy gurning and the mugging, personally, I don't go for that with the Inokin character. But hearing Kurosawa's explanation of it, almost wanting to add in there to add life to something he knew evidently prior to filming it was going to be very stodgy and lifeless, is sort of almost an early admission of defeat on this film, isn't it? That he was kind of like, I'm going to make this thing, I'm going to make it very quick. It's going to be shit. I need to just put something on the camera, just happening.
This is his monkey tennis.
Yeah. So yeah, I find that kind of an interesting element to it. He's kind of being aware of those deficiencies. Also, like I said before, there's a sequence to music of very rapid cutting between all the men, which is quite experimental and probably the most daring kind of series of cuts in any Kurosawa film. He does do kind of
that's
fast characters.
That's what I thought was very Leone, that kind of
yeah. I mean, he does some similar things later on. There are quick cuts between characters in Seven Samurai, but there's a particular bit in this where he makes so many cuts within a second. It would make Michael Bay dizzy, that sequence. But yeah, I mean, that is hyperbole. I'm sure Michael Bay is it's like, whoa, seeing Tiger's Tale. But yeah. So that's where we are with that one. There was a bit. It's interesting you brought up Christopher Nolan because I've actually written down Nolan-esque mix here because there's a bit during the fast cutting where the music's louder than the dialogue. That music starts playing and he's like chanting something, and you're just like, I can't hear what he's saying. So yeah, the Nolan connection continues.
Well, I think we certainly talked about it for longer than the film is interesting.
I think you're right. The production history around it is the more fascinating aspect. But like, I think from here, I'm not going to say we're kind of plain sailing from here, because I don't. I think Drunken Angel is the point where it really starts. But I will say that One Wonderful Sunday is one I have a lot of time for. So the next time we'll be doing No Regrets for Our Youth and One Wonderful Sunday, which, as I sort of described on the previous episode, they kind of form the immediate post-war Kurosawa. Like, he explores post-war themes going forward in some of his other next films, but these ones seem very much like they deal with the aftermath of the war very specifically, and re-examining Japan in the context of the defeat in the war. So that we're gonna do those together, and then from there on in, we're gonna look at the films kind of on a more individual basis. What's your first impressions of what you're watching next?
Well, again, from my very limited kind of research that I'm doing deliberately to keep myself fresh, which way round are we watching this? No Regrets for Our Youth?
I think it's No Regrets for Our Youth followed by One Wonderful Sunday.
No Regrets for Our Youth. Just the title sounds a little bit Terence Davies to me. It sounds like Distant Voices, Still Lives, or something along those lines. So I'm thinking along the lines of that. So I don't know. I'm thinking, or maybe something like a William Wyler kind of. What's that?
Best Years of Our Lives.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, but with a more of a melancholy. From the other perspective, do you know what I mean? So I'm hoping for something along the lines of Best Years of Our Lives, because I watched that very, very recently and really enjoyed it. And I'm thinking that's going to be the sort of the melodrama kind of quite reasonably heavy melodrama, William Wyler style. And then One Wonderful Sunday is kind of sort of compared to before Sunrise on the BFI player, sort of link later, all set over a day. So I'm thinking of kind of like cross between Before Sunrise, and given the image that I've seen of kind of burnt out suburb of Tokyo, kind of Before Sunrise meets Grave of the Fireflies.
Interesting. I think One Wonderful Sunday is the only film in the entire Kurosawa canon that I would describe as sweet. It's a very sweet movie. But yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing them again, actually, both of those, because they're only films I've seen once before. A lot of these films, like, for some reason, Tiger's Tale, that was like my third time seeing it. But like these I've only seen the once. So that's I'm interested to re-examine them anyway. But and you'll see my letterbox scores on them probably change as you did with these last ones. Right. Well, thank you very much for watching, listening. This will be going up as a podcast at some point in the near future. Still looking for a home for that and figuring out how to sort all that out. But yeah, continue to like and subscribe and all that jazz. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time in a couple of weeks.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.